Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along to this first plenary session of our 2019 PHE Annual Conference. I'm Bernie Hannigan from PHE, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. But first of all, message. Fire assembly point is the grass area next to the building. Message. End of message. One of the things that we like to achieve through this conference is for delegates to feel that they have gained something that they can take away that will help them to do their job when they get back to base, and something that will be sufficiently inspirational that they won't forget. And it won't just be good intentions while you're here, and then we'll all go to the quiz, and then it's another day. And I think this evening we will have such a presentation. So Duncan Clark is with us. Duncan was co-founder of a company named Kiln. You will see what his company does. He himself has a background in journalism and writing, largely about energy and climate. And his co-founder, Robin, who's the guy with the beard, comes from a tech background as a mathematician, and together they have helped to give people a tool that they can use to, as we say, tell the story in your data. So Duncan very kindly joined us for a previous PHE conference. It was last year's cancer conference. And I think the audience was really wowed by what they saw and heard. So you come with staggeringly good recommendations. I'm sure you'll be just as good, having missed your train and gotten here just a few minutes early. But we have complete confidence in you. So over to you, Duncan Clark.
Thank you very much. Obviously, I missed the train on purpose. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I will try to live up to the high expectations. So I just want to start by asking, why do we visualize data? And the answer is that we are fundamentally visual animals. And to just briefly make the point, and to flesh that out a little bit, here's a study that I like, which was published a few years ago, and it showed a large number of participants, thousands of photos. And it also showed them thousands of other things like numbers and phrases. And of course, it turns out you can only hold 10 or 20 numbers or random words in your head at any one time. But when it comes to images, you can hold an astonishing number in your brain at any one time. So this is, the three columns here are the proportions, the numbers at the bottom, of the images that people remembered in the experiment that runs as follows. So first, you were shown 2,500 objects over 5.5 hours. So imagine sitting there all day being blitzed with images. And then, just when you thought you'd had enough and you couldn't bear any more, you're asked to look at them all again. But this time, you're given a slightly different set of images. And some of them are completely different, some of them are almost the same, and some of them are basically identical with a tiny tweak. And astonishingly, after looking at 2,500 objects in a day, played again another set of images, in 92% of cases, people were able to identify whether they'd seen the image at all before. But what's really amazing is you're still close to 90% when it comes to the same image but a slightly different color. And then you're only down to 87% when you make a very small difference, such as moving the bread slightly further out in the breadboard. So it's a simple demonstration of the fact that we can hold so much more in our minds visually than we can when it comes to numbers, text, and abstract concepts. The other thing is that visualizing data allows us to reveal patterns that would be almost impossible to discern just looking at numbers. So here's a famous example that some of you, if you've studied statistics, have probably come across already, but it's such a neat example. So Anscombe was a statistician, academic, who said, I'm going to come up with an example of how different things can be visually from if you describe them with statistical methods. So here are 4 data sets with X and Y values. And he said, I'm going to come up with a way so that they have the same X mean, the same y-mean, the same linear regression line, the same correlation coefficient, and the same sample variance, and almost the same sample variance of y in addition to x. So those are the characteristics of those 4 columns. Of course, there'd be no way that you'd be able to tell even that much just by looking at them. But importantly, you wouldn't be able to see the differences, and if you described those differences in text, you would assume that they were all very similar. And of course, you plot them, and you see that they're radically different. And you can tell immediately, even with no statistics training, that in one sense you've got a kind of rough correlation in the top left. You've got a stack on the bottom right where all the x values are the same, but the y's vary a little bit with one outlier. And so really you can just read a lot in a very small number of strokes of a pen. And this is what Edward Tufte, who's one of the fathers of data visualization, calls the data-ink ratio. How much information can you convey with the smallest number of marks? And so that's just I just wanted to set the scene there and say that's why I'm interested in this topic. I'm interested in this topic because visualization is fundamentally sort of wired into our brains. But all of that research about the background to visualization is from an era where when you visualize something, you drew some lines on a chart, you drew some scales for axes with a ruler, and you maybe did it on graph paper. But these days we're in an era where you can do incredible graphics with a computer. And so the kind of things that are on my screen now, all of which are made with a tool, a self-service tool that I'll show you at the end of the talk, allow you to move beyond just saying how do we visualize data and into the realm of how do we tell a story with data. If you have animation, you have sort of the potential for narrative, then you can go a lot further than those visualization pioneers. And so just briefly to put that into 2 questions. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is how do you tell a story with data? And then in particular, how do you democratize that such that it's not only possible for geeks who know how to write JavaScript like me? So just to set the scene in terms of who I am, so I worked in data storytelling probably for 20 years or so. I was at The Guardian. Before that, I was a publisher and author, and I was interested in the narrative behind data. You're interpreting a report, the kind of thing that lots of people here will do in a medical context, but generally for public consumption. And the thing about when you do a data story for public consumption is you have to think, how can I make this engaging? It's not enough that it's accurate, it has to be compelling as well. So that is where I sort of cut my teeth doing that stuff, and that led to setting up this company, Kiln, where we attempted to say, well, given what the modern web browser can do, given what you can do with interaction and animation these days, what would it look like to bring a storytelling sensibility to interactive data visualization? We spent years doing this stuff, and then what we found is that while you could do loads of cool, exciting visualizations, we were still writing them all with JavaScript. And so that led to the sort of third part of my journey in this area, which was creating Flourish, which is a way to enable people without coding skills to create these kind of rich data stories. So today I'm going to focus on the kind of second 2 steps there. I'm going to start by outlining some lessons we learned building hand-built stuff at Kiln, and then move on to how we now encourage people to do it themselves at Flourish. And I'm going to try and cover all of this in approximately 40 minutes to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. I just want to start with an example of how bad visualization can be. And so when I first started working on interactive stuff, this was one of the first projects I ever made. So this was when I was sitting on the Guardian environment desk, and I'd become really interested in this idea that you should be able to have a richer view of responsibility for climate change. So everyone was saying, where are the emissions? Where are the emissions? And I thought, well, it's actually more interesting to look at it in a more nuanced way. Where did the emissions get emitted historically, because they're still in the air? Where did the fossil fuel come out of the ground? Because it's not just about where it's being burned, but it's about who mines it. Surely there's some responsibility there. And then actually, if it's being burned in China, but we're consuming the goods, maybe that's another form of responsibility. And so we had all these different measures, and we made a little drop-down menu, and we had these scales or whatever. But ultimately, the result was quite boring. I don't know if it's still live. Yeah, here we go. So for all sorts of reasons, this just isn't very good. It's a bit dull for a start. When you click around, not much happens. It doesn't really tap into that visual aspect of your brain that is sort of so thirsty for information. A lot of the areas there are no data for, so having those dominate the space visually doesn't really work. And also, looking at it per person kind of makes sense on this sort of map, but if you do it as just the absolute numbers, then it's kind of pointless because it makes Europe look like it's less responsible for climate change than China just because it's broken into smaller countries. So it really just didn't really work. And that was, for me, the kind of point where I thought, this is frustrating because it feels like there's loads of exciting stuff we could be doing here, but these traditional techniques don't quite do it. And so that was how we came to set up Kiln. This was the first project we ever made, and it was an attempt to both introduce a storytelling layer to visualization, but also to move beyond traditional visualization techniques. And that's kind of the story of what we did over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. So in terms of the technique, we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could squish the countries? I don't know if anyone saw that famous atlas in the 1980s where the countries were distorted to show the data points. So we thought if you combine animation with that, you could show, for example, here's where all the world's people are, here's where the money is, here's where the fossil fuel comes out of the ground. You can see the Middle East getting big. Here's where it gets burned, sort of China and Japan growing. Here's where the end goods and services get consumed. So that animation there basically shows you like the bellows of China squeezing industrial manufactured goods into Europe who eventually get to consume them. And then you get a radically different picture if you look at who's at risk from climate change, who's exposed to sea level rise, and who's too poor to do anything about it. So we thought immediately, just thinking a bit more creatively about the kind of visualization techniques puts you in the realm of a richer story already. But the way that I just presented it to you involved me standing in front of the map, telling you what you were looking at so that you could have something that felt a little bit like a video. I was kind of giving you the soundtrack while this was giving you the graphics. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if you could actually stick a soundtrack right in it? So we came up with this idea of what we call narrative visualization, and more specifically in this one, talkies, the idea that you can combine audio with interaction. So if I click play here.
We're used to seeing the world like this. Though if countries are resized to represent their true area, it actually looks more like this. But area is only one way of looking at the world. This site gives some others, such as where the people are,
so you get
and
the
where
idea.
the money is.
If this feels like you're watching a video,
Mainly, though, this
but actually
site is
this
about
is
climate change.
Interactive.
Browse the response.
And so, which has various benefits, because it means you can interact with it while it's playing, you could look different on a mobile phone, etc., etc. It's also quicker to load, because it's just some JavaScript and an audio file. So that was kind of the area that we sort of set out to explore, and we discovered over the years that, and you can look back at Kiln.digital to see all the kind of projects we made in our kind of bespoke days. We found that you could apply this similar technique, sort of more ambitious, creative visualization styles, and storytelling to lots of different types of data and lots of different types of stories. So, if you're going to show change, I'm going to click almost at random here. If you're going to show change over time on a map, you're not going to get much if you just change the colors. But if you allow yourself to sort them into a grid and to change the time slider, you'll be able to see the ranks changing much more clearly. Or maybe you want to see the best performers. Or maybe you want to see that change over time, or in this case, even the demographics, where you can click and see how the population changes, which is, you can see the effects of the First World War there and the Second World War. Actually, the First World War is just going out of view now. Or it might be something like saying if there's a very large number, it's much easier to understand if you, rather than think of it as the number of barrels of oil or something in a year, you think of it as the number of barrels of oil since you loaded this page, and you can watch that ticking up. And once you've got your head around how huge that is, you can start gradually working your way up to how much there's been in your lifetime. 11 times the Dead Sea for me for oil. And so on and so on. So we did lots of different projects in this space, and all of them have these two things in common, which is that if you think creatively about the visualization style, then you can compel people to watch it because people are just drawn to movement and drawn to sort of visual creativity. And if you have an idea of a narrative and you can build that into your graphic, then you can achieve two things at once because you can tell the story with the animation. So here's another simple example. Here's a scatter plot. Now, if you show a scatter plot, even to someone who's quite good at data, the general reaction is a significant moment of pause where they work out what the axes mean. Is this a negative or a kind of positive correlation? Is it a correlation at all, etc.? So this was an attempt to do a very rich scatter plot in the manner that you can do with the modern web. I mean, I don't know if anyone watched the Hans Rosling videos at TED, but his whole thing was just animating scatter plots, basically. And then what he did brilliantly was telling the story around that. So, but with modern technology, rather than the stuff that Hans Rosling used in his earlier work, is you can do much richer things. So you can kind of scale the axes dynamically, so you can keep the dots in view if you want. You can have sort of tracker lines, so at any one moment you can see where an individual data point is, but also where it's going, where it came from. Maybe you want to filter out a particular set of nodes or whatever. Maybe you want to scale them or not. So that was kind of scatterplot done for the modern era, but then if you add a play button to that, you can start explaining to people what it actually means.
To explore the digital divide, let's create a plot of the number of mobile and fixed internet subscriptions against the average speed of those subscriptions. Now let's add a dot for each country representing connectivity in 1986, and a line showing its change over time. To see what's going on, we can color the countries by their income group and scale by their population. In the 80s and early 90s, all the dots are clustered in the bottom left.
So I don't have time to play all the way through, but you get the idea. Introducing the concepts as part of the story, and then seamlessly moving into the story, and then animating between the frames of the story, so that it's effectively giving a PowerPoint presentation, but rather than being a bunch of snapshot images and stumbling text, then there's a kind of nice, smooth narrative. So I just want to quickly go back to the presentation for a minute and look at some rules that we sort of took out from years of building these kind of projects. And you know, I could go on and on. There are probably 20 that I could do, but I think I've got 8 in here. And I want to sort of try and put these. I've selected these such that hopefully they would be useful, even if you were doing quite a simple graphic without any interaction. Even though really what we're interested in is this richer interactive stuff. So the first one is don't try and show too much information at once. And I think this is true actually in almost all forms of imparting information. If you look at the average PowerPoint slide deck, I don't know if you've seen lots today probably, then the average number of words, I don't know what it is, except that it's too much. Like if you want people to understand what you're saying, don't put more than about 30 words on a slide. And the same is true for visual information. Here's a project we did for The Guardian. This was years ago in 2014. And the data set here was a huge spreadsheet showing every single country in the world, and then about 50 to 60 legal protections around gender. So women's rights, broadly speaking. So do women have legal protections around abortion, around harassment, around property, etc. And it was just this overwhelming kind of number of data points, all with a simple yes or no. And so we tried various ways of showing all this information at once, and we concluded ultimately it was just always going to be too much to look at. So what we wanted to do was boil it down to the kind of to the core, and then let people drill into it. And one of the really nice things you can do with interactive visualization is you can show the top level story and then let the user explore. So as I say, this was quite a simple project we did years ago, but it does sort of make that case. So what we did is we put all the laws into categories, so things like domestic violence, harassment, property, each of which have lots of children. We then put the countries into regions. We then computed an average score for each of the regions across the different categories. And of course, we'd kind of made up that metric, so we didn't want to sort of write it in big numbers. But with a visual, you can have sort of soft encoding. So here, the opacity of the colors describes how the overall score for that country, for that region, for that area. So you can see immediately, for example, that the top level takeout from this large data set is that Latin America and South Asia, interestingly, score the highest. The OECD, which I would have assumed was right up there, in fact isn't, with the possible exception of abortion, and Middle East and North Africa, perhaps a bit less surprising, score towards the bottom. But then if you want to know more, so what is it about South Asia that makes it so successful in this area? You can spread that out equally. We can look at Bangladesh, we can see where it's good and where it's bad, actually quite bad on abortion, but good on domestic violence, for example. And then individually within each of these segments, I can click on that, and I've then got individual, these are the actual data points. And then we made it possible to click on these and share a kind of custom tweet, putting it in the context of the data point. So again, just a simple technique which, even though this graphic was a bit fancy to make, the actual concept is very simple. Don't try and show too much at once. And that, even if you were doing, a flat graphic, I just want to show an example of the same point. So we've never really done much in the area of sort of infographics, but we did one as a favour for Save the Children once. And here was the sort of pretty version of the sketch that they gave us. They'd done this whole thing about how nutrition feeds into... malnutrition basically damages the brain. That leads to long-term economic problems, which leads to more malnutrition, which is a sort of cycle of pain and suffering. And so they said, here we go, like we've got all these points we want to make in our infographic, and we've got 10 points, and we want each one with a little icon. And so we kind of drew it up for them. We said it doesn't really tell the story because, firstly, who's going to bother reading this much text? And secondly, the actual facts are they're still just numbers. They haven't become something else. So what we ended up doing for them was this, which basically just bangs you with a single idea in the middle that 165 million children are malnourished, and that's enough to form a ring around the earth. And once you've got that image in your head as a visual animal, then it's such a shocking image, I suspect it's still true, probably more true now, that you might actually go in and start looking at the cycle. And of course, since this is talking about a cycle, you want to display that visually, which is what we've done there. So even if you're doing a simple flat graphic, even if you're just making a chart in Excel, keep it simple, be clear what your story is, and don't show too much at once. Another thing, which as you do move into doing fancier interactive things especially, but again, still when it comes to more pared back things with normal tools, then doing one thing well is better than doing many things badly. If you're trying to engage an external audience, which can mean anyone outside your kind of immediate team, or possibly even people in your team, what you want to do is make them feel that they've really understood something. And focusing on a single, well-implemented piece of visualization will give you the kind of right to get people to listen to the details later. So here's an example of that. This is a project, one of the last projects we made in the sort of agency days when we made these one-off visualizations. So this is a map of every single commercial shipping movement in the world over the space of a whole year. Now, I'm on quite slow Wi-Fi here, so it's occasionally pausing as it sort of catches up with itself. But what this did is it took roughly 250 million data points. So if you look at the raw data, it looks like this. This would load much faster on a wired connection. So this is basically, there are obviously no such things as kind of roads in the sea, but if we zoom in here and give it a second to update, then what we'll see is that we've got an incredible view of the global economy. Oh, it really is quite slow, this Wi-Fi. And we could go in even further and look at, I don't know what particular port that is. Genoa, of course. Or if you come up here to the UK. Okay. Maybe I'll tether on my phone. Then you can see things like there, for example. Firstly, you see this incredible sort of dual carriageway in the English Channel. If we put back on the animation, you can see the direction of travel there. So they're kind of like informal roads that are kind of invisible, except when you look at this incredibly rich source of data. And if you look up here, for example, there you've got Milford Haven. That's all the gas and oil ships waiting for the oil price to spike in order to go in and sell at the appropriate moment, which is how the whole thing works, apparently. You could even turn off the base map here, and if you zoom out to look at the whole world, then you get this incredible view of the world, its population centres as described by where the ships move between them, so a kind of inverse view of the world map. And it's amazing also how these huge cargo ships move all the way up the Amazon River and the Paraguay River and all the way through down to the Great Lakes there. So doing one thing well rather than one thing badly, rather than many things badly, is a great way to, a great rule to bear in mind while you try and do these kind of fancier graphics. And another nice example of that, if it's still live. Oop. I just feel obliged to show this because it was the one that inspired our map. So that's a kind of map of the world. Winds, and again, all the actual raw data is here, is a direction and a speed at grid points all over the world. And then this visualization is just creating this incredibly rich view that implies the movement of the wind from that. So, rule 3, be clear what questions you're asking. And again, this is one that kind of goes a bit beyond the visualizations themselves. And even if you were doing a really simple data presentation with 3 Excel charts and 3 PowerPoint slides, this one kind of applies. There's that kind of the FAQ model, which emerged in the early days of the web as the best way to explain to people coming to a new website what this site is about and what's going on and how it works. The reason that took off is because forcing yourself to ask questions that other people might be asking is a really good way to do clearer storytelling. And so this little example, which has visualizations from the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, I thought was quite a nice, just case in point. The visualizations, well, yes, they're interactive, but they're actually really quite simple. But the thing it's doing here is being really clear about what the questions are. So are global CO2 emissions still rising? Yes, CO2 emissions are still increasing. So you've got the core point across, and having done that, you can use the visual to unpick it a little bit and to give some, put some context around it and let the user drill into it with some interaction. Who are the largest emitters? That depends on your perspective. So just those kind of 10 words or whatever they are kind of gives you the sense of why these buttons exist. So they exist because they give you different perspective to answer this question in 3 different ways. Have industrial countries reduced their emissions? Yes, they have. At the same time, the share of developing countries is rapidly increasing, and we can animate that across to see. So even when you move towards kind of doing nice interactive visualizations, that's no reason to forget that fundamentally imparting data is done better if you're thinking, what questions could people want to know the answer to? Ask those and answer them. So another one, so this is a little bit more of a little bit more quirky to interaction. So one of the things you can do with interactive visualization, which you can't do with traditional data visualization and tools, is make things personal. You can say, I want to give this user a specific experience that, that will make this more interesting and relevant to them. So there are quite a few examples of that. Here's a little one that we made for The Guardian back in our agency days. So you could put in the year of your birth, and that's going to give you a map of global temperatures over 160 years. And as you click next, and again, another good tip here is if you are going to have UX, the fewer buttons, the better, basically. So everyone knows what to do with this graphic because you hit next, and that's all you do. So that's immediately making this graph much more interesting. Previously, it was a wavy graph that I could see was a kind of broad upward trend. Now I can see that actually quite a significant chunk of that upward trend happened since I was born, which is kind of counterintuitive because we all sort of still imagine that we're younger than we are and that the 70s were still quite recent, which turns out not to be true. And then we can say, well, okay, let's project that forward. If we continue to fail to reduce emissions, where does that take us? And the answer is, of course, we're not sure. It depends on climate sensitivity and other unknown factors. But we can start to look ahead in that range. So while I'm still working, and again, this is interactive, so we can just behind the scenes say, we know your age, and we can project future retirement ages, so we can give you a decent back of the envelope about temperatures when you retire, when you're no longer alive, when your children reach the end of their life, etc. And you can kind of suddenly, just that chart now, we've gone from a wavy line with kind of two numbers about long-term change to a kind of map of your own future. And this really does kind of make a difference between something that is interesting and something that to many people might not be. And there are lots of different examples. I don't know if you saw the BBC population one where you put in your date of birth and it told you what number human you were since the beginning of time. Or the NHS birth one, which was actually a Labour Party Facebook campaign. You put your date of birth and it told you what number baby born on the NHS you were. And this went completely viral because everyone was delighted to know they were the 5th millionth baby born on the NHS. But I just want to make the point that although this feels a little bit gimmicky and kind of all this stuff around getting people to share things feels a bit kind of clickbaity maybe, but it's not just a gimmick. It is a way of getting people to engage with things. And if what you're interested in doing is getting a particular audience, maybe policymakers or kind of opinion formers, to listen to what you're saying, then this stuff is important. So here's just a little example. Bill Gates with his 5 million Facebook followers. There's him spotting the thing we did on The Guardian. You can see he's sufficiently old that it doesn't show about his retirement years because he's already retired. But just felt sufficiently compelled by that he wanted to image capture that and put it on Facebook and encourage other people to look at it. So anything that kind of can force people to engage, these same tricks will apply to the policymakers who might make the difference between signing off a drug or not signing off a drug, or banning one thing, or whatever else it is that you think policymakers should be doing. So another sort of expression, another way of sort of saying the same thing is making facts shareable. So if you're going to make a graphic with lots of facts, then it's much more likely that people are going to want to sort of spread the word about them, if, including sort of internally by email or whatever else, if you allow them to drill down and find individual nuggets of information. So I just showed one example of that, which was being able to, in the women's rights graphic, being able to find the individual right and share that on Twitter with a kind of custom tweet. Here's another example. And again, these are all kind of from our early years, which is why so many of them about climate change, because I was still based at The Guardian at that point on the environment desk. So this was who caused climate change in terms of extracting the fossil fuels that came out of the ground. So you can see this is the top 90 producers of fossil fuel companies. If you're interested in investor-owned, then you can click in there and dive in a bit more depth. And again, the sort of thing that you can just do with interactive graphics is just, again, tell the whole story kind of at a level where many of the data points may be hidden, but you can get the flavor, and then let the user drill in. And then if you're someone who lives in Britain, maybe BP is particularly interesting, or you're someone who works at Shell, then ultimately you get a stat having drilled down that is relevant to you, and therefore probably the people you know and work with. So where there are lots of facts that people can kind of surface in your graphics, then it's great if you can allow those to be individually shareable. Sorry, going back and forth a bit here. So rule number 6, if there's no perfect visualization type, invent one. Now, obviously that's a little bit facetious maybe, because not everyone has the time and energy to, invent new visualization techniques. But as a rule of thumb, I think it's a good one to bear in mind that, the standard ways to visualize data are just ideas, they're starting points, and there's always ways that you can build on that. So this was a little data set. This was the second project we ever did. I hope it's still live. I'm not entirely sure it is. Well, it looks like Open Corporates may have forgotten to... yeah, maybe they've taken it down. I will put a version of that up for the next talk I do. But the way this works is that you can probably get most of what I want to say from the little screenshot there. So every dot there is a company wholly or largely owned by Goldman Sachs. And you can probably see at a glance that this is a map. You can probably see that that's America and that's the UK. And then you're probably wondering, what are these, what's that huge kind of shoe-shaped country at the bottom? The answer is that that's Grand Cayman of the Cayman Islands. This one up here is Luxembourg. This is the Seychelles. And so the red are the tax havens. And then those lines are the lines of ownership. So what happened is after the financial crash, the government of America realized that they had absolutely no sense of where all this money was, who owned it and how. So they obliged all these companies, these investment banks, to disclose their ownership shares in other companies and recursively down through the chain. And of course it turned out, a shame I can't show you the live viz, if you hover over these dots, it shows you the chains of ownership. And some of them are 11 or 12 nodes deep. So you find that there's a company in New Jersey, which owns a company in Grand Cayman Islands, which owns a company in Luxembourg, which owns a company in New Zealand, which owns another company in New Zealand, which owns a company in Australia, la, 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 la. And by the time you get down to the actual entity, you've gone through so many jurisdictions that the chance of anyone being able to track it is minimal. But the point here, in terms of the visualization technique, is mainly what we wanted to do was make people feel that they understood. Again, coming back to that, what's the key point you're trying to get across here? And the key point we wanted to get across in this case was how deep these ownership chains were. And the only way to really see that was to be able to hover over the dots and discover them, almost like a game. What's the deepest one you can find? But in order to do that, we had to have a style of map where all the dots were visible, but they weren't overlapping. So we created an algorithm that starts with a map of the world, adds a dot to each country when it finds one. If they don't fit, makes the country bigger, and then you can sort of drag the countries around to it so that they don't overlap. So again, just thinking what you're actually trying to show, what would allow you to show that, and then is that possible to achieve? Lead with your wow. So this is the idea, I mean, this relates to what I was saying before about doing one thing well. This is the idea that if you have a rich data story to tell, then knocking people dead with the first view is going to be extremely effective in holding their attention going forward. And this is true, if you watch videos about public speaking, they all tell you to start, as I failed to do actually today, but to start with some emotive story that just gets people kind of alert and awake at the beginning of the talk, and then you've earned the right to have their attention. So this was a project that we were commissioned to make by The Guardian, and the original story was there's loads of fights going on about whether we should build a new runway at Heathrow, and we thought, well, no one actually cares that much about that other than the people who live in West London, no disrespect to them intended. But we sort of found ourselves exploring, looking for a different angle into this story, and we realized actually that we were 100 years on from the first ever commercial flight. That anniversary, by coincidence, was coming up in about 6 months. And so we thought, well, let's make a historical piece about the history of aviation that kind of leads to these modern debates. And so we started with that, and it looked a bit like this chapter 2 here. This first, I mean, it's actually a really interesting story. The first flight ever, so this is in 1914, just before the First World War, when everything massively accelerated. And a guy basically strapped some wings to a boat, and he auctioned the ticket, and it flew across Tampa Bay in Florida. And he sold it for some massive amount of money, but it could only take one passenger at once, and it only flew 1 meter above the ground. So we thought, this is a cool, interesting story, but again, it doesn't knock your socks off. So we thought, what is the way into this whole narrative about aviation, which then unfolds into climate change and technology change and the role of the war and everything else? And we thought, well, wouldn't it be cooler if you could just watch all the world's planes? And at the time, we even had a live feed of the last 24 hours. So this was a live feed of data. And then you want to be able to see the time of day. And you can get this sense of this incredible kind of global dance of the planes, especially if you start scrubbing this forward and back. You can see what happens at midnight there. You've got East Asia roughly asleep because no one's allowed to land and take off in major urban areas. But then the second it gets to the morning, they start taking off from there, just as Europe goes to sleep. And then about that time, the planes start taking off from the West Coast in America with a view to landing in Europe just as they go to sleep. And you have this incredibly kind of beautiful choreography. I mean, terrible emissions-wise, but it's kind of stunning. And again, we wanted this idea of a kind of story, so when you landed on this, you could press play and you got this kind of idea of a narrative.
Here's an extraordinary fact. Right now, as you watch this, 500,000 human beings are in the sky, many of them high above the clouds in the thin air of the lower stratosphere.
Etc. So again, even when you are leading with your wow visually, thinking what's the wow in this story? And the thing that kind of, for me, worked best was 500,000 humans in the air with their legs sort of dangling down. Imagine the plane's taken away and they're all just moving around. And it's an extraordinary thing. And then we started with that, and then we did the whole historical thing about the birth of the industry. And then we thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could tell that story of the growth since with a bit of colour? And again, the idea that sometimes visualizations in themselves aren't necessarily enough to engage the audience, because if you think about the history of aviation, okay, so this intro animation was nice, it kind of makes you want to kind of interact with it, and it also shows you this incredible story. I mean, we're almost 10 years out of date here now, but you can see the dip there. If I come up here and put some flags on it, you can see they're all around energy. So you've got the oil price spike, the 9/11 attacks, the global financial crisis. But what's amazing is they are noise rather than signal. They are completely removed when you look at the overall trend. And I thought it was incredible when we published this that actually the number of passenger tickets sold had doubled since 9/11, which seemed so recent at the time. But again, it doesn't really give the flavour of global aviation through the centuries. So we thought, wouldn't it be nice if you could play this almost like a harp? You kind of slide over it, and on any one of them, it gives you some interesting fact from that. Yeah, you see, those were the days. Look at that. Silver teapot. That was one of my favourite ones. So that's the first ever in-flight movie, 1925. No sound, because you still got the sound of the engines roaring, and you got to sit in these wicker seats, which looks kind of amazing. There's all sorts of good stuff in here, but it would take... Oh, look, that's good. Anyway, so look at that at your leisure. And then we finally came on to the story about, so what's all this mean for climate change and airport building and the rest of it. But we got a huge amount of traffic on this story, and the reason was because you hit people when they arrive with this compelling image and this compelling fact. So lead with your wow. And then finally, remember that the web is two-way. The interesting thing about doing interactive visualization is you're basically creating web content. And when you create web content, the web is unique as a sort of presentation format because it actually can receive information as well as give information out. So, this isn't necessarily straightforward to do, but here's, again, this was one of the first projects we ever did. And what we did is we gave a kind of a quick, sort of almost kind of Newsnight-like 2-minute clip that shows you, is the world getting better or worse? And this was the Rio +20 summit, which looks at all these different indicators. And you can press play and have...
What's changed in the last 20 years, and for better or worse? There are now a lot more of us, almost 30% more, mainly due to increases in Asia and Africa. We're living longer too. Life expectancy is up by a few years in most of the world, though there are still huge gaps between, say, Japan at 83.
So, a pretty simple, rapid-fire tour of data about human lifestyle, basically, and economic indicators. But the broad story here was basically the economy's got really good. The overall indicators on health globally have massively improved, but we are completely screwing up the global environment, and we're not very good at life satisfaction. So ultimately, are we getting better or worse? It's completely subjective. It depends how you measure those things against each other. And so we thought, wouldn't it be cool if, at the end, rather than that just being a question we pose, in the abstract, we thought, well, wouldn't it be better if it was kind of like a survey? So you can now say, okay, well, I'm male, I am in my 40s, sadly, I live in Europe, and I think it's got better, and I can submit that. And again, I get a kind of custom shareable nugget there that I can put out on the web, but I can also then see the results. And now this is a little bit meta, because this is a data visualization about the responses to a data visualization. But you can see that actually the results are quite interesting. Obviously, this is people who read the Guardian website, so not a cross-sectional sample that would achieve statistical significance tests. But interesting that young men in Africa were the most positive group, and older women in Asia were the most negative group. And you can click through to see them all. So again, I feel that that's an area of data visualization that is kind of still about to be, still waiting to take off because it's a bit more fiddly to do and it needs richer tools. But anyway, here's another example of the same thing. This was a project we did for, can I click on that to access it? Project we did for LSE, where actually, I'm not going to show that because I'm going to run out of time. But this was a project for LSE where you can answer a quiz about how equal or unequal you think the world is, and those results were saved so that the academics can actually use that in their own work. So it's kind of doing two things at once. So that's the kind of background on everything we did. I've only got a few minutes left, so I just want to sort of round off by talking about where that led us to. So the problem with that whole approach of saying, here's the data set, what do I want to do? I want to tell a story, what tools do I have? I can do anything I want because I can write code, so what code should I write to tell this story? The problem with that approach is that it's really slow, therefore it's really expensive, and therefore most people can't use it without commissioning an expert with a big budget. So that was what led us to build Flourish. So Flourish is a tool which I will quickly show you. And the idea was to create something where non-coders could, or coders too, maybe different types of coders, could create interactive visualizations and data stories with the same sort of level of sophistication as the sorts of things I've been showing you, but you could just do it yourself with a web browser. So this is a kind of self-service tool. We've tried to make it kind of as easy to use as something like Google Docs or whatever. You can see a few random examples. So this is just things in my account. You can click to create a new visualization, and you're presented with a whole bunch of templates, but these templates range from simple things like, say, line charts, and you can see over here you've got settings to change how they're displayed, and over here you've got the data, and I can change the data here, and you'll see this immediately animates to a new state. So the idea is that this is a visualization tool with animations and with storytelling built in that allows you to not just do simple things like line charts, but also to do sort of sophisticated transitions. But that's just the simple templates, right up to being able to do really fancy stuff, like, for example, charts that you've probably all seen these going viral on Twitter in the last year. So this is what we call a bar chart race, where you have a simple data structure of change over time, and then you can put that into a graphic with images that, again, you can then video that and put it in a PowerPoint presentation. You can embed it interactively. The people here are more scientific, so if you think of something a little bit more like maybe a violin plot. So here's a little example of a scatter plot. I could come over here and say, actually, I want on the x-axis, I want to have some group, on the y-axis, maybe some group, that will animate up like that. I could put on a bee swarm plot or a box plot, and suddenly do all these slightly more sophisticated visualizations. I could then animate those forward and back. Or something like this. This gets widely used by journalists in addition to people in other sectors, including healthcare. So here's a map that we just made yesterday. So this is a hex map of UK constituencies, but then you can shade that to show election results. But you can also do much fancier things like 3D projected maps. So this is an example of a choropleth map over a base map showing, in this particular case, GDP per capita in different US counties. So this is interactive, and you can see this is extruded them, which actually is not just cool and fun, but actually really helps you see the outliers, because it's quite hard to get that just from shading. But then the idea of Flourish is that it lets you also do this kind of storytelling stuff that I've been banging on about for the last hour. So you can see here in the Flourish story editor, and I can now capture these different views and start to animate between them. And then I can either use that, I could use that as a presentation, so I could just click next or with a clicker and be moving through the data in a presentation, but still actually able to interact with it. I could also embed that as an interactive story on a website. I just publish it and grab the embed code there, and that'll give me something like this. And so the idea is this is a template-based system, and we have been adding more and more templates to the mix so that you can do almost all standard visualization stuff now, but also increasingly more obscure things such as something like this, where you're animating around a, let's put some navigation on this one, animating around sort of nested variables and that kind of thing, or you know, even specialist things for plotting particular types of data, like this is basketball shots or whatever. And we've started to do some stuff specific to health as well. So here's a little quick example of how you could use Flourish to visualize clinical trial data. So every individual participant in the trial is represented here. You can click next and start to break them out by their gender. So you can see the gender mix in the trial. Maybe size them by a numerical variable, which might be, you know, the number of exacerbations they had, or their weight, or whatever else. You can animate that onto a map, see where they're from, but they're still interactive. You can still interact with them individually, and then you can start visualizing the. Looks like I've set this to a city height, but you can put these and actually start looking at the results. So, did previous treatments correlate with, you know, the placebo or the actual drug, etc. So, the idea is that you can come into Flourish, you can pick a template, you can upload your data, and you can quickly make something rich and visually beautiful that can also be the basis of a structured story. And then you can embed that online, or you can stick it in a presentation. So I think I'm a couple of minutes over, so I will stop there. But thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much, Duncan. We do have some time for questions. We have microphones, 2 microphones. Do we have any questions? Questions? Right in the middle here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really nice to have that remind me of the Hans Rosling presentation. They were really powerful. I can see this being public. I can see it being media. Has it been taken up at all in the academic literature, sort of in the sort of additional resources in a format which is very different from the standard paper?
So we've just started to see academics using it more and more, and I think the reason is that increasingly, this isn't really my area, so tell me if this is right, but it seems like there's a trend to move away from traditional sort of printed journals towards everything being online, and that totally changes the technology you can use, because the whole flow previously has been the author creates their charts, or maybe the journal sort of makes a fancier version of them, but they're all designed to be PDFs basically. And as people are moving online, you can start to actually just embed graphics in them. We had someone write the other day actually and say, can I just check whether I can put this on, I can't remember the name of the open journal, but there's a requirement on that journal that anything you publish has to be Creative Commons friendly. And then we ran into this sort of slight edge case where we thought, well, it's not obvious whether that's true or not, because we own the IP for the template code. So we said, you're fine to share it and put it on there, but you would need to have a note that a caveat about that. But I mean, that's just an example from the other day. And so we have had quite a few academics in the last month or two sort of signing up for Flourish and starting to use it. So I think what's going to happen more and more is that the academic sort of research community will just start embracing interactive visualization, because it's just so much richer. And if you, in particular, I mean, we did these projects for LSE a few years ago. They ran a competition to say, of all the papers published by academics in LSE in the last year, who would like to have theirs visualized by professionals? And it was really interesting experience, because 4 very diverse papers won, and the academics' first question for us was immediately, well, send us the data so we can work out what to do with it. And I think in only one case did they have a spreadsheet ready to send. So all the other 3 papers have been through peer review. But when we said, where's the data, they said, well, it's kind of in a strata model. I could try and get it out. And you think, well, apart from anything else, how did this get peer reviewed? Like, how did anyone properly review this without being able to access the raw data? And then when we did get the data, actually being able to play with it interactively ended up with us non-experts flagging a couple of errors that then they were, you know, they were grateful to receive them. But for me, it showed that actually the interactive process actually really helps with review in addition to kind of engaging an audience.
We have been warned.
Other questions? One of the things I was thinking about is that you repeated several times that despite, you know, really cool tools, etc., that the core points that you make were really very fundamental and independent of the technology that you're using. I think so. Today we had workshops about things such like finding the best evidence, user-centered design, embedding behavioral change. Perhaps we're complicating things, and we didn't have anything about the storytelling. So we used it in terms such as refine your search question or develop your logic model. But I think you put it a bit, perhaps if we focus more on what is your point?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what question you answered, it's almost every piece of writing I've ever done, I've found a useful, because this is something I came across when I was writing about the web years ago, kind of like, where did this FAQ concept come from? And I just found it really useful as a sort of self-review thing, that if you've written something, just to think of it with an FAQ hat on as a way to sort of self-edit, and it works really well. Like, what questions would people want to ask? Does this actually answer them? And I think, yeah, it's a good rule for life, that one, over and above visualization.
Great, oh, super. So I remember when Cricket Graph came out. Does anyone remember that? God, I'm so old. That was my first ability not to have to draw it with an actual pen or use Letraset in a museum. Yeah. Duncan, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.